Hi, everyone. Welcome and good afternoon to our continuing webinar series on the U.S. Civics course. We're going to be focusing on the second part of the United States Constitution lesson, which goes specifically over and summarizes a lot of the information within the Constitution that we certainly use today, that we understand today. And I'll be more than happy to answer a lot of different questions that you'll be having from this webinar. My name is Paul. I am the social studies instructor here at Penn Foster High School. If you want to be able to reach us, we are available by phone at 1-888-427-1000. We also have the help and support page, which allows you to be able to type in email questions as you move along in your program as well. Both great ways of being able to contact us. And there are also a lot of great webinars and live help available within the high school program. So take a look at the messages within your message center. The alerts have been coming into your account probably for most of the last month or so, or for the month of April, I should say. So take a look at those. Make sure that you are registering for webinars, attending those live help sessions, and be able to get a lot of help from myself, the other instructors and teaching assistants within the Penn Foster High School program. So we are certainly here to help you. We want to help you, and feel free to let us know what we can do for you. So today's webinar is going to be covering, as I mentioned, the Constitution itself. We'll be talking about just a brief summary of what it takes to be successful within the United States Constitution lesson, as well as a brief summary of the constitutional preamble and then the branches within the U.S. Constitution. We'll also be examining the powers of Congress, the presidency, and our federal court system. And then finally analyze the other articles within the Constitution. So first off, just in general, the lesson itself, and really all of our courses are set up in much the same way. A few of our courses do have textbooks or ebooks, depending on how you enrolled. And so, but for everything, you are going to have reading assignments within your lessons. And those reading assignments do have specific objectives that are covered. And those objectives really help us know exactly what we want students to come away from the lessons understanding and being able to do. So we focus our reading assignments based on those objectives, and then also our practice exercises within the assignments. So the self-checks, the reflect and respond questions, and the discover more questions. All focus on those objectives. So the better you are reading the material based on the objectives, the more that you are taking notes, reading based on the objectives, and then able to complete those self-checks. Those are all ways of preparing for the exams, because the exams themselves, just like the practice exercises and the reading assignments themselves, are based on the objectives. So again, the better you understand those objectives, the better off you're going to be when you come to that exam. And the exams are open book. You can use the notes that you've written, any highlighting or any post-its that you put within your reading assignments. You can have access to all that material while you are taking your exam. So feel free, if you have those resources, use them as you are taking your exam. Also, you will receive a recording of this of this webinar. So as you are listening to the webinar, as you're viewing it, please know that you will receive a recording of this tomorrow afternoon. So you don't have to worry about memorizing everything. You'll have everything available to you tomorrow afternoon. You'll get the same webinar. You'll get a recording of and be able to use that as you prepare for your exams. So the introduction to the Constitution is the preamble. And really, the best way of thinking about the preamble is that it is the objective. It's the objective of the program, or of the Constitution. And it sets up the fact that the Constitution and the American government has specific goals in mind for the country. So first off, that the Constitution, the American government is always looking to become more perfect, a more perfect union based on the idea that we can continuously change our government. We can continuously change our leaders. We can consistently change our Constitution, which is something that we'll talk about a little bit later. And each of the branches of our government can work towards making the Constitution more perfect. So it's never an idea of America is correct or is perfect at this specific moment or at any moment in American history. We've kind of gone along with what our founders believe, that we are consistently trying to become more perfect, trying to become a better society and a better government. The preamble also makes reference to justice within the country, that our government is going to always work towards peace within the country and outside the country, as well as respecting the rule of law. That without rule of law, there is no justice, there is no peace. So our founders, our constitutional document, our founding documents are all based on the fact that justice comes with the rule of law and due process. Equally important, domestic tranquility. So peace within the borders. That our founders believe that the government should want the country itself to be relatively at peace. There's always going to be debate within a large country and a very diverse country like ours, but our founders and throughout our government's history always wanted to look for ways of keeping peace, keeping people calm, keeping people happy and good with the country. Also, the general welfare. Tranquility can also look at stability, by the way. But the common welfare, our founders really wanted to make sure that we were taking care of our citizens. That part of the purpose of government is to make sure that it's taking care of its people, that fulfilling the welfare. So our Constitution really focuses on having a government that is responsive to the people, wanting to make sure that people are taken care of. And if the government's not taking care of the people, then obviously there are ways of resolving that through elections, through process of courts, the court system. So there are a lot of different ways that our preamble, the parts of our preamble certainly are used to fulfill the preamble. Also, the common defense. The Constitution calls for our federal government to make sure that the people are protected through our military, through our foreign policy dealings. Certainly working towards a common defense, making sure that people are safe. Big word within the Constitution, big word within our founders, the founding documents like the Declaration of Independence, is the idea of liberty, that our government was going to protect our liberty, expand our liberty. So just kind of like the same idea as making our union more perfect, that as we are becoming more perfect, people have greater and greater liberty. Throughout American government history, there are times, time in, time out, that more people gain more liberty, that we very rarely or ever have a moment that we're taking away rights, based on the idea that we are looking, again, more perfect, greater justice, more liberty. And finally, the last part of the preamble, speaking to the point that they are creating this government, that our founders created this government for the posterity, which is the future descendants. So really, again, that the more perfect union, creating justice, creating tranquility and stability, peace, promoting our welfare, and providing for the common defense and common liberty for all people in the United States and future descendants would have all of these pieces within the preamble. So as a quick little kind of summary of what's in the Constitution, so once we get past the preamble, we want to know, okay, how is the Constitution actually going to be creating this? So the Constitution is divided up into 7 sections. The first article goes over the legislative branch. Second, the executive branch. Third, the judiciary. Fourth, looking at the relationship between the states of the Union. The process of amending the Constitution. A clear statement that the U.S. Constitution was the supreme law of the land, that all federal law and state law must follow the Constitution. And then the process of ratification was equally important. And finally, the amendments to the Constitution, starting with the first 10, which were amended or which were created shortly after the Constitution was passed, but our first 10 amendments being the Bill of Rights. So let's get into a little bit more detail about each of the branches of government. It's important to know that this section is really doesn't go into a lot of detail about each branch of government. That is covered much more in the Governments of the United States lesson, the third lesson within U.S. Civics. And the second section of that U.S. Civics lesson, or of that Government of the United States lesson, will be covered next week at the same time. So we'll actually be covering the Presidency next week on the Government of the United States lesson in Civics. But in general, generally the responsibilities, we'll start off with Article 1, which is Congress. So Congress was created as a bicameral legislature, which followed the format of the British Parliament, having two houses, bicameral, two houses, our House Representatives and our Senate. In each Congress, there's a focused leadership, the majority and the minority leaders. And Congress is set up as being very much self-regulating, that each chamber creates its own rules, creates its own standards, and each new Congress, so every 2 years, these rules are approved, are voted for by the members of the Congress. Their main function is passing laws and budgets for the United States, for the government. Specifically, the congressional power comes along with budget bills and spending bills. So every year, a new bill that becomes law that creates the budget of the United States. Our Congress is doing that actually currently, setting up exactly how much money is going to be spent on different parts of our federal government. They also have other kinds of bills that become law. So when Congress sets up a law or proposes a bill, that goes through a process, and we'll talk about that. That's something that we talked about more in the Government of the United States lesson. But each House of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, do need to vote for each law or each bill that is passed. They also set up tax bills and bills associated with our debt. As our national debt continues to rise, our Congress does approve that raising of the debt. Among the things that the Congress regulates, they also regulate commerce, which is essentially trade between states of the Union as well as other countries trading with us. Congress also has the power to declare war. So in many cases along U.S. history, when we had World War I and World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, there had to be approval by Congress for those wars to actually take place and be funded. And finally, the Congress also has the ability to impeach and then sentence federal officials. So that brings us to our first poll question. What is the congressional power in wartime? Does the Congress execute the war strategy? Does it declare war? Or does it propose a timeline for battle? So setting up a war, where battles we're going to be having. Which answer is correct? Again, is it executing war strategies, declaring war, or proposing a timeline or timetable for battles. Give you guys another 5 seconds. Finishing up in 3, 2, 1. And thank you. So it would be the declaration of war. So Congress, when the president wants to go to war with a country, they have to go to Congress to declare the war. Once that declaration of war is set up, is approved by the Congress, then it's up to the president to actually implement the war strategy and also deal with the and then our generals who are in charge of the actual war effort go into the battles. So the first step is typically that declaration of war, or at least the funding of the war by the Congress. So each branch of each House of Congress have specific responsibilities and specific rules. As I mentioned, they are both self-regulated. Starting off with our House of Representatives, has 435 members, and they are based on populations of states. So every 10 years, our government has what's called a census, in which the government mails out documents to every household in America and asks for all the people in that house to be counted, and then mailed back to the federal government. The government then uses that information to know how many people are living in a state and how many people are living in specific areas. And the government will use that information to decide how many members of the House of Representatives are going to come from each state. And the more populated a state, the more representatives. And the more people are in that country, or I'm sorry, in that state, one census to another will decide how many more or how many less representatives that state has. Our next census is going to be in 2020, in about 3 years, and there's already a prediction that there will be some districts will be removed from states in the Northeast and the Midwest, and likely going down to states in the West, in the Southwest, and also in the Southeast. So more people are moving from the Northeast and the Midwest down into the Southern states. So some of those state representatives, or some of those House of Representative seats, are going to move from the North down to the South. The main leader of the House of Representatives is the Speaker of the House. They are voted. That Speaker is voted for by the majority within the House of Representatives. So because the Republicans have the majority right now in the House, the Speaker is also a Republican named Paul Ryan from Wisconsin. So the Speaker is someone who is the most powerful member of the United States House of Representatives and sets the agenda within the Congress or within the House. By law of the Constitution, the House must begin all tax and budget bills. The reason for that is that at the time of the Constitution being written, the members of the House were the only people at the federal level who are elected directly by the people of America. And so our founders believed that because they were the closest people to the people they represented, that it was only right for tax bills and budget bills dealing with taxes and spending should start with the people who are closest to the voters. The rules generally do favor the majority party within the House of Representatives. So because, again, the Republicans hold the majority in the House, the Speaker and the Republican majority are able to pass just about everything that they want to pass as a majority party. We saw that recently with the healthcare bill, for instance, that because that the Republicans in the House really just dealt with each other. They only really talked to each other and tried to make sure that they had a majority of the Republican Party in Congress to actually vote for that law or to vote for that bill. The Senate is different, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the House was able to vote on that bill only dealing with Republicans, only negotiating with Republicans, because those were the rules set up by the House. All House members have 2-year terms. So all members of the House were voted in last year in November of 2016. All of them are going to be up again for re-election. All the districts are going to be up for re-election again in November of 2018. So every 2 years they have to go and try to get elected or try to get re-elected. The Constitution does stipulate that people who run for Congress have to be at least 25 years old. And as I mentioned, there are direct elections. So the people of each district directly vote for their members of Congress, their members of the House of Representatives. The Senate is a little bit different. It has 100 members, so much smaller than the House, and it's 2 members from each state. So no matter how big or how small a state is, they have two senators regardless. So even though Texas has a lot more people than, let's say, Utah, Texas will have a lot more members of the House of Representatives, but they will still only have 2 members of the Senate, just like Utah does. The most powerful member of the Senate is called the Senate Pro Tem. That is a person who is usually the most senior member of the majority party. So just like the House, the Republican Party holds a majority in the Senate. And the Senate Pro Tem is a gentleman named Orrin Hatch, who is the longest serving member of the Republican Party. He's been in the Senate for, I believe, 5 or 6 terms. Which is quite a while. We'll talk about the time frame in a second. But he is the one who presides or leads the Senate in their day-to-day business. The main job of the Senate, special job of the Senate, I should say, is confirming presidential appointees. So right away when after President Trump was inaugurated, became president, his cabinet was the first group of people who were voted for by the Senate. Since then, the president also appointed a Supreme Court justice, which was approved by the Senate. And then now he's also filling in the rest of his cabinet, the rest of his officials in the departments that the president leads are also being approved by the Senate at this point. The rules in the Senate actually favor more the minority because of how long debates can take, how many rules there are that make sure that really forces consensus, that it can't just be one party ruling both the House and the Senate. Both parties have to really be part of negotiations within the Senate. So just like for instance, going back to the healthcare bill, the Senate in the House, it was mainly just Republicans negotiating with each other. In the Senate, in order for a bill to pass, for a new healthcare law to be passed in the Senate, it has to be negotiated between both Republicans and Democrats. And many more of the Senate Republicans are much more moderate, are more interested in having a deal with Democrats than the Republicans in the House of Representatives. Senators have 6-year terms, and about a third of the Senate, about 33 senators, are up for re-election every 2 years. So the senators who were elected last year in 2016 will be up for re-election again in 2022. And the senators who are up for re-election next year in 2018 had been elected, or their seats were elected back in 2012. So they were running about 6-year terms as members of the Senate. To run for the Senate, folks have to be 30 years old or be turning 30 years old. Originally, the Senate was a position that was appointed by each state's legislature. Since the 17th Amendment, though, they have been freely elected, so they've been elected directly from the people from each state. So moving on to Article 2, which goes over the presidency. The president is elected to a four-year term. So President Trump was just elected in 2016. He's going to be up for re-election in 2020. And the president is elected by what's called the Electoral College, in which it's not directly voted by the people, but the electors who gather to actually vote for the president will typically vote for the same person who the majority of the state, in the state, popular vote, the same person that they elected. Presidents have to be at least 35 years old. The youngest president we've ever had was actually 43, which was Teddy Roosevelt. Presidents also have to be natural-born citizens and residents of the United States for at least 14 years. So it's people who are either born in the United States or have parents that were citizens of the United States can only be presidents. In terms of presidential powers, first off, presidents will review bills that come from Congress. So once the House and the Senate approve a bill, it then goes to the president for either being signed, so showing the president's approval, veto, which means rejection, and then the bill has to go back to Congress for either a revote or had to go back to negotiations in terms of fixing the bill to make it approved by the president, or what's called a pocket veto. A pocket veto means it's typically used by a president who doesn't necessarily agree with the bill, but doesn't want it to go back to Congress. So the president will what's called pocket veto, in which they will basically ignore the bill, and after 10 days, 10 business days, so outside of weekends, if the president leaves it alone, it becomes law. If the president doesn't sign or veto it after 10 days, it becomes law. The president's power also is to negotiate treaties with other countries, and is also commander-in-chief of the U.S. military. So after Congress declares war, it is up to the president and up to his Defense Department to actually run the war. President also has the power to appoint federal judges and executive officials. Furthermore, the Constitution does talk a little bit about the vice president. Generally, the vice president has very little power. And there are two authorities that the Congress provides to the vice president. The first one is the ability to preside over the Senate. Now, as I mentioned, it's usually the Senate pro tem, the most senior member of the majority party. In extreme circumstances, the vice president will go and preside over the Senate. It's usually when there's going to be a tie. If there's going to be a 50-50 vote, so 50 votes for a bill and 50 votes against the bill, it's going to be the vice president who presides over the Senate in order to vote as a tiebreaker. It happened actually recently when the Secretary of Education for the president came up for a vote to be approved by the Senate. 50 senators wanted her to become Secretary of Education. 50 did not, and it was up to Vice President Mike Pence to vote that tiebreaker and confirm her for Department of Education. The second job of the vice president is to be able to take over the presidency. So essentially, the phrase used to be that the vice president was a heartbeat away from the presidency. That is their job. That their job is to make sure that the presidency continues no matter what happens. Any other job comes really at the pleasure of the president. And our most recent vice presidents, really starting with Al Gore, who's Bill Clinton's vice president, and then Vice President Dick Cheney, and to a lesser point, Vice President Joe Biden, were some of the more powerful vice presidents in our history. That's really up to the president to say, okay, I want my vice president to do certain jobs, to be in charge of certain responsibilities. In most of American history, the vice presidency has become more and more powerful because of what the president actually wants them to be in charge of. Article 3 goes over our federal court system. And much like the vice presidency, the federal courts are very not well defined. They're not really well explained or given much power. And it really comes, the main power is what's called to interpret the Constitution. And early on, for the first several years, the federal courts did not really have its purpose, know what its purpose was. And it wasn't until not until 1802, in which the federal court system established its rule of judicial review, essentially saying that in order to interpret the Constitution, the federal court system has to be able to have judicial review, meaning that it's allowed to review laws and strike down federal laws that do not follow the Constitution. That if our federal court system does not believe that a federal law follows the Constitution, the court can eliminate that law. Now that does the federal court system can't do that on its own. It can't just say, well, I don't like this, this law that was just passed, we're going to call it unconstitutional. Americans have to bring up a lawsuit that says this rule or this law is unconstitutional because of this reason. We have 3 levels of the federal court system. We have district courts, appellate courts. The district courts are typically within a small geographic area, so a small section of the state. The appellate courts are typically take up several states. And then our Supreme Court, which is the court for the entire country. So the Supreme Court will only hear some cases that came before the appellate court. And the appellate court, the Court of Appeals, is only going to hear a certain number of cases that came from the district court. So each of them handle less and less court cases as you move up through the court system. Finally, we'll just kind of go over the remaining articles of the Constitution. Article 4 goes over the relationship between states. First of all, the Constitution does require that laws must be, all state laws are equal, and they must be followed. And it requires cooperation between states. So if the state of Vermont has a law that someone broke and that person drives away to Massachusetts, it's up to Delaware to say to the state of Massachusetts, hey, we need this law followed. You need to bring this person back over to Delaware for that person to be tried for that law. It also stipulates that there are equal rights between all people between states, as well as when a state is admitted into the Union, into the United States, there must be a representative government established within that state. So when our last 2 states, Alaska and Hawaii, became states, part of the requirement was that they needed to have this representative government. So they each have a governor, they each have a state legislature to be able to run the government just like the rest of the states in the Union. They must also protect everyone with protect people from in the state with an armed forces. So our state National Guard, our state police, our local police. Article 5 goes over how to amend the Constitution. And then Article 6 goes over the fact that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. That is the top law. That it also requires that the federal government will pay off all debts of the states, as well as all people who are within the United States must follow the oath of upholding the Constitution. And finally, the ratification process, that each state was going to vote to approve the Constitution, and at least 9 out of the 13 original states had to approve the Constitution for it to become law. That does occur, and we do have the Constitution that we have today. Much more of the details within the Constitution will be covered in future webinars, in future lessons. So at that point, I do encourage you to continue to register and view our webinars that are coming up. Be able to view past ones. If you missed any of them and you had registered for them, you would have received the email. But I am more than happy to answer any questions you have about this lesson or anything else about your course. If there aren't any questions, I will stay online for a few more minutes. I want to thank you all.